"The mansion is ours. Mom gets nothing." Those were the words my own son said to me, in my own home, in front of our entire family. My name is Evelyn Hayes, and for years they saw me as a quiet widow, someone to be managed and eventually set aside. What my son and his greedy wife didn't know was that the nothing they were leaving me was a secret fortune that had paid for their cars, their vacations, and their entire lifestyle. They thought that family meeting was my surrender. They were wrong. It was their judgment day. Have you ever been completely underestimated by the people who should have known you best? I would be honored to hear your story in the comments. The smell of David's old leather-bound book still lingered in his study, a comforting ghost in a house that had started to feel less like a home and more like a waiting room. I ran my fingers over the spine of his favorite book, a collection of Robert Frost poems, and remembered his words, spoken in this very room as we watched the Seattle rain streak down the windows. "Evelyn, the strongest walls aren't made of stone, but of foresight." I just wished I knew what he had foreseen. My gaze drifted past the oak desk to the sprawling lawn that rolled down to the gray, choppy waters of Lake Washington. The steady hum of the lawn service, my lawn service, was the only sound. It was a crisp October morning, peaceful on the surface, but the quiet in this house had a weight to it now, an emptiness that 20 rooms couldn't fill. My phone buzzed on the desk, startling me. I had been hoping for a call from Mark, but the caller ID showed a blocked number. I answered cautiously. "Mrs. Evelyn Hayes?" a polite, professional voice asked. "Yes, this is she." "This is Amanda from Cascade Visa. I'm calling to verify a recent charge on the supplementary card under the name Mark Hayes. The amount is $2,147.38. Can you confirm this charge?" I felt a familiar clenching in my stomach. I closed my eyes, picturing the bill. "Yes," I said, my own voice sounding distant. "Yes, I can confirm it." "Thank you, Mrs. Hayes. The payment will be processed from your primary account." I hung up without another word and leaned back in David's worn leather chair. I didn't have to ask what the charge was for. Mark and Chloe had mentioned a much-needed weekend trip to a wine country resort. I had pictured them relaxing, and the thought had brought me a small measure of happiness. But seeing the number in stark reality made it feel different. It was more than my entire monthly pension. I told myself it was what mothers did. You give, you support. You make sure your only son is happy, even when he's a grown man with a wife and a life of his own. Gathering my resolve, I dialed his number. He picked up on the fourth ring, the background noise of a busy office buzzing through the line. "Hi, Mom," he said, his voice distracted. "Is everything okay? I'm in the middle of something." "I'm fine, honey. Just wanted to hear your voice," I said, trying to keep mine light. "The credit card company called, but don't worry. I handled it." There was a brief pause. "Oh, great. Thanks, Mom. You're a lifesaver. Listen, I have to jump on a conference call. We'll talk soon." "Of course, dear. Are you two still coming for Thanksgiving?" "Thanksgiving? Oh, yeah, definitely," he said, the relief in his voice palpable. He had his excuse to end the call. "We'll be there. Gotta run, love you." The line went dead. I held the phone for a moment before placing it back in its cradle. I walked out of the study, my footsteps echoing on the hardwood floors David and I had picked out together. I trailed my hand along the cool marble of the fireplace mantel. Remembering the winter he installed it, his face smudged with soot, but beaming with pride. In the dining room, I stared at the long mahogany table, big enough for 12. I could almost see a younger Mark, no older than 7, spilling grape juice on the Persian rug and David laughing as we cleaned it up, saying it gave the house character. Every corner held a memory, a piece of a life that felt a million miles away. Just then, my phone buzzed with a text message. It was from Chloe. "Can't wait for tea giving. Hope the old furnace is working okay this year. Wouldn't want you to be cold." The words, punctuated by the winking emoji, were a perfectly crafted dart, a casual, seemingly caring message that was really a jab at the house's age, at my age. The chill that ran down my spine had nothing to do with the furnace. I looked at the grand dining room, already picturing the Thanksgiving table, laden with food and surrounded by family. I told myself this year would be different. This year, we would feel like a family again. I had no idea how right and how terribly wrong I was. That hollow promise of a family Thanksgiving echoed in my mind for weeks. In the end, my hope was a fragile thing, easily broken. The scent of roasting turkey and simmering resentment filled the air in equal measure as the day finally arrived. I had spent 2 days preparing everything to perfection. The mahogany table was set with my finest china, the silverware polished to a gleam, and a centerpiece of autumn flowers brought a splash of life to the room. From the living room, the drone of the football game, Mark's one non-negotiable tradition, provided a constant jarring backdrop to the quiet tension in my heart. They arrived precisely at 2 o'clock. Mark gave me a brief, one-armed hug that felt more like a formality than an embrace. Chloe, stunning in a cashmere sweater that probably cost more than my monthly grocery budget, offered me a cold cheek to kiss. Her eyes swept over the dining room, and I saw a flicker of something. Impatience, perhaps, before it was replaced by a practiced, brilliant smile. "Everything looks wonderful, Evelyn," she said, her voice smooth as silk. The meal began with the strained pleasantries that had become our new normal. I served the golden brown turkey, the creamy mashed potatoes, the cornbread stuffing made from David's mother's recipe. I played the part of the happy matriarch, asking about Mark's work and Chloe's latest charity luncheon, ignoring the hollowness of their one-word answers. As I brought the turkey to the table, I picked up the silver carving set, its weight familiar and comforting in my hands. "This was David's favorite carving set," I said, a wave of nostalgia washing over me. "He saved up for months to buy it for our first Thanksgiving in this house." Chloe smiled thinly. "It's lovely, Evelyn, but a bit old-fashioned, don't you think? Modern sets are so much sharper." The jab, so casual and yet so precise, was a direct echo of her text about the furnace. Mark flinched, a slight tightening around his eyes, but he said nothing. He just took the tools from my hand and began to carve, his movements stiff and awkward. We ate in relative silence for a while, the clinking of forks against plates the only punctuation to the announcer's shouts from the other room. Then I tried to salvage the day. "Why don't we go around and say what we're thankful for?" I suggested, hoping to invoke the ghost of happier times. I started. "I'm thankful for this home and for my family." Mark mumbled something about a recent success at work, his gaze fixed on his plate. Then it was Chloe's turn. She placed her fork down, dabbed her lips with a napkin, and looked around the table with an air of profound sincerity. "I'm thankful for family," she began, her eyes landing on me, "that looks out for each other, especially making sure our elders are safe and not overwhelmed." The compliment was a perfectly disguised weapon. Before I could process the sting, she reached into her designer handbag. "Speaking of which," she said, her voice bright and helpful, "I saw this and just thought of you." She placed a glossy brochure on the pristine white tablecloth, right next to the gravy boat. The cover showed a group of silver-haired seniors laughing as they played shuffleboard. In elegant script, the title read, "Pine Ridge Estates, a community for your golden years." I stared at it, my blood turning to ice. A retirement home. She had brought a retirement home brochure to Thanksgiving dinner. I looked to my son, my eyes pleading with him to say something, to put an end to this cruel performance. He wouldn't look at me. He just cleared his throat and pushed a stray cranberry around his plate with his fork. "Mom," he said, his voice low and heavy with a guilt that wasn't strong enough to inspire courage. "Chloe's right. We've been worried. A place like this, it would be less of a burden." The word burden hung in the air, sharper than any carving knife. I looked from my son's averted face to the smiling strangers on the brochure in my hand, and in that moment I knew this wasn't about my safety. It was about my home. After they left, the leftover turkey sat on the counter, a testament to a feast that had nourished no one. For days, I moved through the house in a thick fog, my actions robotic as I cleaned up the remnants of a celebration that had felt more like a siege. The mansion, my sanctuary, now felt cold and cavernous. Each room, once filled with the warmth of memories, now echoed with the chill of my son's words. I would find myself standing in the middle of the living room, unable to remember what I had come in for. My mind a looped recording of Chloe's saccharine voice and Mark's averted gaze. The Seattle rain began on a Tuesday and didn't stop, streaking down the large windows that overlooked the lake, blurring the world outside just as my own reality had become blurred and uncertain. My mind kept replaying Mark's use of the word burden. It wasn't just the cruelty of it that haunted me. It was the chilling familiarity. I remembered it now with painful clarity. A few weeks ago, I was in the garden pruning David's roses just below the patio. I'd overheard Chloe on the phone with her mother, her voice a sharp, irritated whisper carried on the breeze. It's just such a burden having to worry about her all the time, she had sighed. At the time, I had flinched, but quickly made an excuse for her. She's just stressed, I'd told myself. She doesn't mean it. Now I understood. Thanksgiving wasn't an impulse. It was a planned offensive, and that word was their weapon of choice, honed and practiced. The heartbreak I felt began to curdle, hardening into a small, hot spark of anger in my chest. The phone finally rang on Wednesday afternoon. It was Mark. "Mom, it's me," he began, his voice strangely formal as if he were addressing a business associate. "I've been doing some thinking since Thanksgiving, and Chloe and I have run the numbers. Logically, with property taxes and upkeep, it just doesn't make financial sense for you to maintain the house." I stayed silent, gripping the receiver. In the background, I could hear Chloe's faint, insistent whisper, the cadence of a director feeding lines to a nervous actor. The words Mark used weren't his own. They were sterile, corporate, asset utilization, maximizing equity, downsizing for efficiency. It was Chloe's vocabulary coming out of my son's mouth, a grotesque ventriloquist act. "We think you'll have a much better quality of life, Mom," he continued, the rehearsed speech flowing on. "Less stress, no maintenance, all the financial benefits." "The financial benefits for whom, Mark?" I asked, my voice quieter than I intended, yet it cut through his script. He faltered for a second before ignoring the question. "In fact," he said, pushing forward, "I've taken the liberty of scheduling a real estate appraiser to come by on Friday, just to get an idea of the market value. No pressure, of course. It's just for planning purposes." The casual audacity of it, invading my life with his plans, his schedules, pushed me past my grief. The anger I'd been suppressing finally found a voice. "Mark, your father built this house for us," I pleaded, a last desperate appeal to the boy I had raised. "Every window, every floorboard, it's all we have left of him." His reply was instantaneous, delivered with a flat, chilling finality that told me the line had been prepared. "And now it's time for it to take care of us." Click. He hung up. The dial tone buzzed in my ear, a monotonous, indifferent sound in the crushing silence of the mansion. That one. Simple word. Us. He didn't say, "Take care of you." He said, "Take care of us." That slip, so small and yet so vast, revealed everything. This wasn't about my well-being. It was an acquisition. A cold clarity pierced through my fog of pain. I walked numbly into David's old study, not knowing what I was looking for, only that I couldn't find the answers in the present. David's study was a time capsule, and I was about to break the seal. After Mark's chilling words on the phone, my feet had carried me here automatically, as if seeking refuge in the one place in this house that was still entirely my husband's. The air was thick with the scent of old paper, wood polish, and the faint, pleasant aroma of his pipe tobacco that had seeped into the curtains over the years. Dust motes danced in the single beam of weak afternoon sun that cut through the gray, rainy day, illuminating the tools of his life, the perfectly aligned T-squares and protractors on his drafting table, the shelves sagging under the weight of books on structural engineering and classical architecture, the faded photograph on his desk of the two of us on our honeymoon, young and oblivious to the quiet sorrows the future held. I felt a wave of despair wash over me. What was I even looking for? An answer? A sign? David was gone, and I was alone, cornered by my own son. My search began aimlessly. I pulled open the top drawer of his old steel filing cabinet. It was filled with the mundane artifacts of a life well lived, a history told in paper and ink. There were warranties for appliances we no longer owned, paid-off mortgage statements from 30 years ago, and a neatly bundled packet of receipts from a family vacation to the Oregon coast when Mark was 10. I could almost feel the gritty sand and taste the saltwater taffy. Each piece of paper was a small, painful reminder of the life they were trying to erase, to declare null and void. There was nothing here for me but ghosts. My movements grew more frantic, driven by an urgency I didn't understand. I turned to the deep closet where he kept his winter coats and the precious rolls of his original architectural drawings. The faint scent of his tweed jacket, a mix of wool and winter air, hit me, and for a moment I buried my face in the fabric, expecting to feel his arms around me. Pushing past the ache, I reached into the very back, behind a stack of rolled-up blueprints for a public library he'd designed but never built. My fingers, searching for something, anything, brushed against the hard, square corner of a heavy cardboard box. I pulled it out into the light, my heart beginning to hammer against my ribs. It was a simple, sturdy archive box, covered in a thick layer of dust that suggested it hadn't been touched in years. Written on the side in David's bold, clear handwriting were two words that made me stop breathing. Evelyn, contingency. It was the foresight he'd always talked about, the quiet planning he did while I was the one managing the day-to-day. My hands trembled as I wiped the dust from the lid, revealing a small, simple padlock. A surge of frustration was quickly replaced by a bittersweet memory of David's little habits, his love for small secrets. I turned the heavy box over. Taped securely to the bottom, shielded from view, was a tiny silver key. With a deep, shuddering breath, I carried the box to his desk and set it down. The click of the lock opening was unnervingly loud in the silent room. I lifted the lid, half expecting more old financial statements. But this was different. This was something else entirely. Neatly organized within was a thick file, professionally bound in black leather, its tabs marked with legal-sounding phrases I didn't recognize. And resting on top, pristine and untouched by time, was a sealed cream-colored envelope. My name was written across the front in his familiar, elegant script. My fingers shook as I carefully broke the wax seal he had so formally applied. The paper inside was crisp, the ink a dark, determined blue. "My dearest Evelyn," the letter began. "If you are reading this, it means you feel cornered, and I suspect I know by whom. Do not let them mistake your kindness for weakness. This is not just a file, it is a fortress. In it you will find the name of my lawyer, Arthur Gable. He understands everything. He holds the keys to the kingdom I built to protect you." I stared at the words, my vision blurring. Kindness for weakness. He had seen it. He had known. I pulled a business card from behind the letter. Arthur Gable, Esquini Estate and Trust Law. A name I hadn't heard in years, a face I dimly recalled from the funeral. A kingdom? David had been a respected architect, a good provider, but we had always lived so modestly, so carefully. What on earth had he been hiding? fear is a cold companion, but for the first time in months as I sat in the profound silence of David's study, it was joined by a flicker of hope. I held the heavy cream-colored business card in my hand, the embossed letters feeling solid and real beneath my trembling fingertips. Arthur Gable, Eskini Kraus Estate and Trust Law. The name Arthur Gable jogged a memory from the blur of David's funeral, a quiet, sharp-eyed man in a perfectly tailored suit who, instead of offering empty platitudes, had squeezed my hand firmly and said, with an intensity that cut through my grief, "Call me if you ever need anything." At the time, I thought it was just a kind gesture. Now I understood it had been a promise. My hand hovered over the phone on David's desk. For a moment, doubt crept back in. What if this was a mistake? What if this kingdom was just a metaphor, a husband's loving exaggeration? But the alternative, facing Mark and Chloe's cold, calculated plan alone and defenseless, was unthinkable. I took a deep breath, the scent of old books calming my nerves, and dialed the number. A crisp, professional voice answered, "Gable and Associates." "Hello?" I began, my own voice steadier than I expected. "My name is Evelyn Hayes. I'm calling for Mr. Gable. My husband, David Hayes, suggested I contact him." There was a brief pause, then the voice warmed considerably. "Of course, Mrs. Hayes. Mr. Gable left standing instructions. He can see you this afternoon at 3. Will that be suitable?" The drive into downtown Seattle was surreal. The familiar skyline, the Space Needle piercing the gray, drizzling sky, all seemed different now, as if I were seeing it through a new lens. I was no longer just a grieving widow on her way to an appointment. I was a woman on a mission, following a map left behind by the man who had known me best. Mr. Gable's office was on the 40th floor of a discreet old-world building. The reception area was hushed, with dark wood-paneled walls, comfortable leather chairs, and the quiet confidence of old money. When Arthur Gable emerged, he was exactly as I remembered, sharp, impeccably dressed, with kind eyes that held a deep intelligence. He greeted me not with pity, but with a profound, quiet respect that I hadn't realized how much I'd been missing. "Evelyn," he said, forgoing the formal Mrs. Hayes, "I am so sorry for your loss, and I am sorry it has taken this long for us to speak. David made me promise not to interfere unless you initiated contact." He led me into his private office, a sanctuary of calm overlooking the city. After we were seated, he didn't wait for me to explain. He simply swiveled in his chair and pulled a massive black leather-bound file from a locked cabinet. The gold lettering on the spine was simple: the Hayes Trust. "David was more than a brilliant architect, Evelyn," he began, placing the heavy file on the polished mahogany desk between us. "He was a remarkably shrewd investor. For over 30 years, he funneled the profits from his commercial projects into a series of diversified investments. He did it all quietly, through this irrevocable trust he established to protect you." He opened the file, and my breath caught in my throat. It was filled with deeds, stock certificates, and financial reports. "He structured it so that you are not just the primary beneficiary, Evelyn," Mr. Gable continued, his voice gentle but firm. "He made you the sole executive director. After his passing, you have total and complete control over every asset, every decision. Legally, Mark has no claim to any of it until you are gone." My mind struggled to comprehend the scale of it all. I had spent the last few years counting pennies, carefully managing my small pension, while this fortress, as David had called it, had been waiting for me. Mr. Gable seemed to understand my shock. He pulled a single sheet of paper from the file and slid it across the desk. It was a consolidated summary statement, dated from the end of the last quarter. My eyes scanned past the lists of holdings and went straight to the bottom line. The number was so large it seemed unreal, a string of digits preceded by a dollar sign and followed by 7 zeros. I gasped, my hand flying to my mouth. The room seemed to tilt slightly. Mr. Gable leaned forward, his expression full of a gentle, profound sincerity. "You are not a resident of the mansion, Evelyn," he said softly. "You are its queen." I walked out of the office into the Seattle drizzle, the city lights blurring through my tears. The weight of David's secret, his incredible gift, was overwhelming. I was one of the wealthiest women in the state, and my son had just tried to pressure me into selling my house for pocket change. The real estate appraiser walked through my home with the predatory gaze of a wolf circling its prey. He arrived on Friday morning, precisely at 10, with Mark and Chloe flanking him like handlers. I had spent the morning preparing for my role, slumping my shoulders slightly, letting a look of weary confusion settle onto my face. When I opened the door, I made sure my hand trembled just a little as I gestured for them to enter. "Mom, this is Mr. Finch," Mark said, avoiding my eyes. "He's just going to take a quick look around." Mr. Finch, a slick man with too much gel in his hair, gave me a cursory nod before his eyes began to devour the room, cataloging my life's possessions as potential liabilities. Chloe, however, was in her element. She walked beside him, pointing out features with the proprietary air of a homeowner, not a guest. "The view of the lake is the main selling point, of course," she said, waving a dismissive hand at the living room. "But all of this will have to be opened up. These walls, so confining." I stood silently in the archway, a ghost in my own home, while they performed their autopsy on the life David and I had built. When they reached the kitchen, Mr. Finch made a thoughtful, humming sound. "The foundation seems solid, but the kitchen is hopelessly dated," he said, tapping a polished granite tile that David had laid himself one sweltering July. His words were a perfect echo of Chloe's from Thanksgiving. Chloe nodded eagerly, completely unaware that she was critiquing a property she had absolutely no claim to. "Exactly," she said. "We'd replace all of this. A modern, chef-grade kitchen would add so much value. We'd replace all of this." The word choice was not lost on me. I watched them, my face a carefully constructed mask of sorrow, but my mind was a steel trap, recording every greedy glance, every condescending word. They moved through the house, from the dining room where Chloe noted the chandelier was tacky to the master bedroom where Mr. Finch declared the closet space inadequate for a modern couple. As they stood in the doorway of David's study, I saw my opening. I allowed my lower lip to tremble and wrapped my arms around myself. "It's just so many memories," I whispered, my voice thick with feigned emotion. I looked at the desk, the chair, the shelves. But where will I put all of David's things? The performance was, I had to admit, quite convincing. Mark finally looked at me, a flicker of genuine guilt in his eyes before he quickly looked away. Chloe, however, stepped forward and patted my arm, her touch light and utterly devoid of warmth. "Don't you worry about a thing, Evelyn," she said, her voice dripping with false sympathy. "We'll handle it. We'll make sure everything is sorted." Her condescension was so profound it was almost a work of art. They finished their tour and gathered back in the living room. Mr. Finch clicked his pen and looked at a figure on his clipboard. "Given the extensive renovations required and the current market conditions," he announced, "I'd appraise the property at $400,000. It was an insultingly low number for a lakeside property of this size, at least half of its true value. I watched as Chloe's eyes lit up, the predatory glint returning. A low appraisal meant a quicker, less complicated sale. Mark turned to me, his expression a practiced blend of sympathy and pragmatism. "See, Mom?" he said softly, as if he were breaking gentle news. "It's not worth what you think. It's best to sell now." They left a few minutes later, confident in their victory, believing they had successfully herded a confused old woman toward the inevitable. Chloe gave my shoulder a final triumphant squeeze at the door. I watched their car pull out of the driveway and disappear down the street. Then I straightened my back. The sad, lost look vanished from my face, replaced by a cold, hard resolve. I walked to the phone, my steps no longer shuffling but firm and purposeful. I dialed the number from memory. "Mr. Gable," I said, my voice steady as steel. "It's Evelyn Hayes. They took the bait." There was a pause on the other end, and then I heard his quiet, appreciative chuckle. "Excellent," he said. "Let's begin." My neighbor Susan caught me in the driveway the next morning, her eyes full of a worry that felt genuine, a stark contrast to the manufactured concern of my family. I was trimming the dead heads off David's favorite rose bushes, the simple, repetitive motion a small anchor in the storm of my thoughts. She walked across the dew-kissed lawn that separated our properties, holding 2 mugs of coffee, her brow furrowed. For 20 years, Susan had been more than a neighbor. She was a quiet witness to my life, a constant, steady presence. "I'm probably overstepping, Evelyn," she said, handing me a warm mug. "But I saw you had visitors yesterday, the man in the slick suit. Your son and his wife looked awfully pleased with themselves. Is everything all right?" Her directness was a relief. I was tired of the games, the pretense. I took a sip of the coffee and let out a long, weary sigh. "They're worried about me, Susan. They think this house is too much for me to handle alone." Susan's expression sharpened. She was a retired journalist, and her instincts for sniffing out a story, or a lie, had never faded. She glanced back toward her own house, then lowered her voice. "Evelyn, I don't want to meddle, but that's not the only visitor they've had. I saw Mark and that wife of his meeting with a different man in a very expensive suit last week down at the coffee shop in the village. He wasn't a real estate agent. He looked predatory." I froze, the pruning shears still in my hand. A different man. "What did he look like?" I asked, keeping my voice even. "Older, silver hair, sharp jaw. He carried a briefcase that looked like it cost more than my car," she described perfectly. The way he listened to them, with this cold, calculating smile, it gave me the creeps. They looked like they were plotting something, not having a family discussion. A cold dread washed over me. A realization that clarified the fuzzy edges of their plan. The appraiser was just a piece of theater. The real work, the legal machinations, was happening with someone else. They hadn't just hired an agent to sell my house. They had retained a lawyer to take it. This wasn't a simple push to get me to move anymore. This was a coordinated legal assault. I must have looked as shaken as I felt because Susan put a comforting hand on my arm. "There's more," she said, her voice dropping to a near whisper. "I was on my porch the other day, hidden behind my wisteria. Chloe was on her cell, pacing back and forth on your lawn. She was laughing. Evelyn, a triumphant, nasty kind of laugh." Susan paused, taking a deep breath before delivering the final blow. She said, loud enough for me to hear, "Don't worry, the lawyer says it's just a matter of time. Once we get power of attorney, we can finally get things done." Power of attorney. The words hit me like a physical blow, knocking the air from my lungs. It all clicked into place with horrifying clarity. The concerns about my health, the suggestions I was overwhelmed, the talk of making things simpler. It wasn't about convincing me. It was about building a case against me. They weren't just trying to get my house. They were planning to take my voice, my rights, my very identity away completely. "Power of attorney," Mr. Gable repeated, a grim, knowing look on his face as he leaned back in his leather chair. The atmosphere in his office was no longer just one of quiet confidentiality. It had sharpened, focused, becoming a strategic war room. I had just finished recounting what my neighbor Susan had overheard. Instead of shock, I saw a flicker of something else in his eyes. Opportunity. "It's the classic move of a greedy heir," he said, steepling his fingers. "They're getting sloppy. Desperate people always do." His calm assessment settled my own frayed nerves. The fear I had felt upon hearing those words, power of attorney, began to recede, replaced by a cold, clear resolve. I thought of David's letter, of his faith in my strength, of the fortress he had built for me. "Let them," I replied, my voice devoid of the tremor it had held just days before. "Let them think they have me cornered. The best traps are the ones the prey walks into willingly." A slow, appreciative smile spread across Mr. Gable's face. "David always said you were the strategist in the family. Now I see it. Their arrogance is the opening we need." He swiveled to his computer, his movements efficient and precise. "Their plan to seize control via a power of attorney is predicated on one thing: that you still control the asset they want. We are going to remove that predicate from the equation entirely." He explained the plan, his words laying a path through the legal minefield. It was bold, clean, and devastatingly simple. "We will execute a private sale of the mansion from you, as an individual, to the Hayes Trust," he explained. "The trust will purchase the property for its fair market value, using the liquid assets it already holds. It is a perfectly legal transaction. The deed will be transferred, the sale recorded. To the outside world, nothing will appear to have changed. But legally, the house will no longer be yours to give, sell, or have taken from you." He printed out a thick document, the top page titled Bill of Sale. "Once this is signed and filed, their power of attorney, even if they managed to coerce you into signing it, would be useless. They would have legal control over your personal checking account, and little else." A wave of relief washed over me, so potent it almost made me dizzy. This was the fortress David had promised. "And the timing?" I asked, my mind already leaping ahead. "That, Evelyn, is where your performance comes in," Mr. Gable said, a glint in his eye. "They are expecting a fight from a scared, confused woman. You will give them one. When they present you with their documents, you will hesitate. You will seem fearful. You will ask for more time to think. You know them better than I do. What will they do when they sense weakness?" I thought of Chloe's impatience, her love of drama and control. "She won't tolerate a delay," I said. "She'll insist on a final meeting. She'll want witnesses, other family members, to apply pressure and legitimize their actions." "She loves an audience." "Perfect," Mr. Gable murmured. "They will build the stage for their own humiliation. All we have to do is let them." He pushed the bill of sale across the polished desk, along with a pen. "This is the point of no return, Evelyn." I looked down at the document. It felt impossibly heavy, a legal testament to the end of my family as I knew it. For a fleeting second, I saw Mark's face as a child, beaming up at me. Then I saw his face at Thanksgiving, cold and distant. I picked up the pen, the weight of it solid in my hand. I thought of David, of his love and his foresight. My signature was clear and unwavering. Mr. Gable took the document, reviewed it, and placed it neatly into a folder. He looked at me, his professional demeanor softening. "It's done," he said. I held the pen, the ink still wet on the page where I had signed my name. I had just given away the house my husband built, and in doing so, I had saved it. Now all I had to do was wait for their next move. The call came on a Tuesday. I had spent the past few days in a state of strange, suspended calm, waiting. When my phone rang and Mark's name flashed on the screen, I took a slow, deep breath, summoning the fragile, confused woman I needed to be. His voice, when I answered, oozed a false, syrupy concern that turned my stomach. "Mom, how are you feeling?" he began, the words too sweet, too smooth. "Chloe and I have just been so worried since the appraiser came by. We know it's a lot to process." I made my own voice small, hesitant. I'm all right, Mark. Just thinking." "Well, that's actually why I'm calling," he said, and I could practically hear Chloe whispering his lines in the background. "Mom, Chloe and I have been talking with our lawyer." He paused for effect, confirming Susan's warning with a chilling directness. "He's prepared some documents to protect you, a power of attorney. It just makes everything simpler for everyone." Power of attorney? I repeated, letting my voice crack just a little. I twisted the phone cord around my finger, a nervous habit I hadn't had in years. Oh, Mark, that sounds so official, so permanent. I don't know if your father would have wanted something like that. It all seems so complicated. My performance was, I hoped, convincing. I was the dithering widow, overwhelmed by legal terms, clinging to the memory of a husband who was no longer there to guide her. I could hear the sharp, impatient sigh on his end of the line. My reluctance was working perfectly. Mom, it's not complicated, he said, his tone shifting from patient to patronizing. It's standard procedure. It's to help you. It means we can handle the bills, the property taxes, the sale of the house, without you having to worry about a thing. The sale of the house, I murmured, letting my voice trail off as if the thought were too painful to complete. It's just happening so fast. His frustration was now palpable. Look, he said, his voice taking on a new, decisive edge. How about this? We'll all get together on Saturday. We'll have a family brunch here at the mansion, nice and casual. Our lawyer, Mr. Jensen, can come. We'll invite Uncle Robert and Aunt Carol, too. They can all help explain it so you understand. We just want you to be comfortable with the process. There it was, the invitation to my own execution, gift-wrapped as a family brunch. He was walking right into the trap, just as Mr. Gable and I had predicted. They needed witnesses to pressure me, to create a public performance of their dutiful care. I let the silence stretch, making him wait, making him think I was truly wrestling with the decision. Finally, I let out a long, shuddering sigh, the sound of a woman surrendering to the inevitable. All right, Mark, I said, my voice heavy with feigned defeat. If you really think it's for the best, I'll be there. Great, Mom, that's great, he said, the relief flooding his voice. You'll see, it's the right decision. You won't regret this. He said his goodbyes and the line went dead. I hung up the phone and a slow, cold smile spread across my face, an expression I hadn't worn in years. A nice, casual brunch to strip a mother of her rights. It was perfect. Absolutely perfect. The days leading up to the brunch were a master class in deception, and I discovered, to my surprise, that I was a remarkably gifted actress. I spent the time in a state of meticulous, purposeful calm. I tended to my roses, I baked a loaf of David's favorite sourdough, and I filled the mansion with the quiet, domestic hum that they expected of me. On the surface, I was the defeated widow, preparing her home for a final, formal surrender. Underneath, I was a general preparing her battlefield. On Thursday, I called Mark, my voice pitched with the slight, wavering uncertainty I had perfected. Mark, dear, about the brunch on Saturday. Should I bring something? A quiche, perhaps? Or my lemon scones? The condescension in his voice was so thick I could almost taste it. Just yourself. Mom, he said, with an audible, patronizing smile. Don't you worry about a thing. Chloe and I will handle everything. Handle everything. The phrase echoed with years of meaning. Handling my bills, handling my generosity, handling me. All right, dear, I whispered and hung up. The night before the brunch, I went into David's study for the last time as the woman they thought I was. Under the warm glow of the desk lamp, I laid out my arsenal. It was not a collection of weapons, but of truths. First, I placed the bank statements in a neat pile, the ones showing 3 years of rent payments, car loans, and Chloe's extravagant shopping trips, all funded by me. Next to it, I placed the single-page summary of the Hayes Trust, its formidable bottom line a silent testament to David's quiet genius. Finally, I set down the centerpiece, the crisp, official bill of sale, its ink dark and final, legally transferring this mansion from my name to the trust. This was my proof kit, my declaration of independence. My phone rang at precisely 9 o'clock. It was Mr. Gable. His voice was calm, a steadying presence. Evelyn, just confirming for tomorrow. I will arrive at 11:30 sharp. Let them get comfortable in their own arrogance first." "Understood," I replied, my own voice just as steady. "The stage will be set." After we hung up, my gaze fell upon the silver-framed photograph on the corner of the desk. It was from a 4th of July picnic years ago. A younger, laughing David with a small 5-year-old Mark perched on his shoulders, his face alight with pure, uncomplicated joy. A powerful wave of grief washed over me, not for my husband, but for the son I had lost. The sweet boy in that photograph had vanished, replaced by a man who saw his mother's home as collateral. The love I felt for that child was the very reason I had to follow through with this. This wasn't about punishment. It was about consequences, the one lesson my protection and my money had never allowed him to learn. On Saturday morning, I awoke before the dawn. The house was silent, holding its breath. I walked to my closet, my hand gliding past the rows of sensible beige and muted gray dresses I had worn like a uniform for years. At the very back, preserved in a garment bag, was a sharp, elegant crimson dress, the color of a defiant heart. It was a silk sheath David had bought me for our 30th anniversary. I hadn't worn it since he died. As I put it on, the fabric felt cool and unfamiliar against my skin. It was not the dress of a grieving widow. It was battle armor. The doorbell rang at exactly 11 a.m. I looked at my reflection in the grand hallway mirror. The woman looking back was not the fragile, confused elder they were expecting. Her eyes were clear, her posture was straight, and the crimson of her dress was a silent promise. I took a deep breath, smoothed the silk over my hips, and walked to the door. It was showtime. My dining room had been transformed into an execution chamber, and I was the one they intended to sacrifice on the altar of their greed. I had greeted them at the door, my crimson dress a stark contrast to the somber, pitying expressions on the faces of the guests they had summoned. Mark's Uncle Robert and Aunt Carol were there, the same relatives who, years ago, had walked through this very room and praised David's architectural genius. Now they looked at me with the kind of gentle, sorrowful condescension one reserves for the terminally ill or the hopelessly confused. Robert, a man who prided himself on his business acumen, appraised me as if I were a failing stock. Carol, whose love for drama was legendary, watched with a hungry curiosity, thinly veiled by a mask of familial concern. They were not here for a brunch. They were here to witness a mercy killing of my autonomy. The table was laden with a beautiful spread Chloe had ordered from a caterer. Delicate quiches, elaborate fruit salads, gleaming carafes of orange juice for mimosas. But it was all just a prop. The food sat untouched, radiating a chill that had nothing to do with its temperature, a feast for vultures waiting for the kill. The atmosphere was a suffocating performance of concern. "Thank you both so much for coming," Chloe said, her voice a carefully modulated symphony of grace and worry as she poured coffee. "It means the world to Mark and me that you're here to support Evelyn through this difficult transition. We just want what's best for her." I remained a silent, dignified observer, my hands folded calmly in my lap, an island of stillness in their carefully orchestrated sea of anxiety. Mark was a nervous wreck, unable to sit still, his eyes darting from me to Chloe, to the smug, confident man sitting at the head of the table, their lawyer, Mr. Jensen. Finally, after the small talk had withered and died, Mr. Jensen cleared his throat, signaling the main event. He opened his polished leather briefcase with a theatrical snap. "Evelyn," he began, addressing me as if I were a child. "As we've discussed, Mark and Chloe's primary concern is your well-being. Managing an estate of this size comes with significant fiduciary duties, which can be overwhelming for anyone, let alone someone in your position." He slid a thick stack of documents across the table. They stopped just inches from my fingertips, the paper feeling cold and final. "This," he announced to the room, "is a standard power of attorney. It simply allows Mark, as your loving and only son, to handle the more complex aspects of your finances. It's a tool to protect you from the stress of it all, to protect you from yourself. He droned on, his voice a monotonous wave of legal jargon and veiled insults. He used phrases like mitigating cognitive decline and easing the burden of decision-making, words meant to sound official and caring, but were in fact weapons designed to paint me as senile. With every word, he tried to strip me of my competence, my history, my very mind, right in front of the family who had once respected me. I let him speak, my expression unreadable. My silence seemed to unnerve them far more than any argument could have. When he finished, Chloe took her cue. She picked up an expensive fountain pen and placed it neatly on top of the documents, pushing them directly in front of me. Her hand briefly rested on mine, her touch cold and reptilian. "It's for the best, Evelyn," she said, her voice dripping with a false sympathy that was almost nauseating. "Just sign, and we can all enjoy this lovely brunch." The entire room held its breath. 4 pairs of eyes were fixed on me, waiting for my inevitable, quiet surrender. I looked down at the signature line where my freedom was meant to die. Then I slowly lifted my gaze and looked past them to the grandfather clock in the corner of the room. Its brass pendulum swung with a steady, unhurried rhythm. Tick, tock. The sound was the only thing in the world that felt honest. The clock read 11:29 a.m. "Actually," I said, my voice clear and steady, cutting through the suffocating tension, "I believe we're waiting for one more guest." Just as Chloe opened her mouth to object, her face a mask of indignant confusion, the doorbell rang. Its clear, melodic chime cut through the suffocating tension in the dining room like a judge's gavel calling the court to order. Everyone froze. Chloe's mouth snapped shut. Mark's head whipped toward the hallway. Even their lawyer, Mr. Jensen, looked momentarily startled, his smug composure faltering. I placed my hands on the arms of my chair and rose slowly, my crimson dress a silent statement in the muted room. "Excuse me," I said, my voice calm and even. "I'll get that." I walked to the front door, feeling their collective stare on my back. I opened it to find Mr. Gable standing on the porch, his expression serene, his briefcase held firmly in one hand. He gave me a slight, reassuring nod. "Arthur Gable," their lawyer, Mr. Jensen, sputtered from the dining room, his voice a mixture of shock and dawning horror. He shot up from his chair. "What is he doing here?" It was a beautiful moment. Mr. Jensen's panic was a testament to Mr. Gable's formidable reputation. The sharks of the legal world always recognize the apex predator. Mr. Gable stepped inside, his presence commanding a quiet authority that instantly shifted the power dynamic in the house. "Good morning," he said, his gaze sweeping over the assembled party. "I am Arthur Gable. I am here today as Mrs. Evelyn Hayes's legal counsel." He walked into the dining room and placed his briefcase on a sideboard with a soft, definitive click. Mark and Chloe were stunned into silence, their mouths slightly agape. Uncle Robert and Aunt Carol exchanged confused, nervous glances. Mr. Gable's eyes fell upon the stack of power of attorney documents still sitting in front of my plate. He gave them a look of profound disinterest. "You can put those away, Mr. Jensen," he said, his tone polite but firm. "They are, for the purposes of this discussion, entirely moot and irrelevant." Chloe let out a small, strangled gasp and instinctively snatched the papers toward her, as if to protect them. The color was rising in her neck, her mask of gracious concern finally cracking to reveal the raw fury beneath. Mark finally found his voice, turning on me, his face a storm of confusion and anger. "Mom, what is this?" he demanded, standing up so abruptly his chair scraped against the floor. "Who is this man? What have you done?" His voice was rising, laced with the panicked frustration of a man whose perfect plan was unraveling before his eyes. I didn't have to answer. Mr. Gable stepped forward slightly, positioning himself between me and my son. "Your mother has done nothing but exercise her rights as a property owner, Mark," he said, his voice calm and paternal, which only seemed to enrage Mark further. Filled with an arrogant certainty, my son turned to our relatives, his voice booming with righteous indignation as he played the part of the wronged, dutiful child. "This is a waste of time," he declared, gesturing around the magnificent room. "This is about our family's security, our future. This mansion is ours. Mom gets nothing." The ugly, defining words of his greed finally hung naked in the air. Chloe looked triumphant. Aunt Carol looked horrified. Mr. Gable, however, simply offered a slight, almost sad smile. He walked to his briefcase and slowly unlatched it. "That's a very interesting assertion, Mr. Hayes," he said, his voice dropping into a quiet, lethal register. He paused, letting the weight of the moment settle over the room. "Especially since, as of last Tuesday, your mother no longer owns this mansion." The silence in the room was absolute, a vacuum where all the air, all the certainty had been sucked out. Mark stood frozen, his mouth half open, the arrogant words he had just spoken still hanging in the air like a poisonous vapor. Uncle Robert's coffee cup was stalled halfway to his lips. Mr. Jensen, their smug lawyer, simply stared, his face a mask of slack-jawed disbelief. The untouched food on the perfectly set table seemed to mock us, a feast for a future that would now never arrive. The only sound was the heavy, deliberate ticking of the grandfather clock in the corner, each second marking the end of their world. It was Chloe who broke the spell. Her face, which had been flushed with triumph moments before, was now a pale, ashen gray, the color of old stone. "What? What did you say?" she whispered, the words so faint they were barely audible. Her composure, the impenetrable shield she had worn through months of masterful manipulation, finally shattered, leaving behind a raw, trembling panic that was plain for all to see. Mr. Gable didn't answer her directly. Instead, he walked with a calm, unhurried pace to the dining table and placed his briefcase upon it. He opened it and took out a single crisp document. He held it up for all to see, a simple piece of paper that held the weight of their ruin. "Your lawyer, Mr. Jensen, was kind enough to read the first page of his proposal," Mr. Gable said, his voice resonating with quiet authority. "Allow me to read you the second and final page of this matter." He unfolded the document. "This is an irrevocable bill of sale, filed and recorded with King County last Tuesday. I will read the pertinent clauses aloud." He cleared his throat and began, his voice clear and unwavering. "A legal pronouncement of their doom. Be it known that on this date, the 17th of October, the property located at 125 Lake Point Drive, commonly known as the Hayes Mansion, was sold in its entirety by its owner, Mrs. Evelyn Hayes, to the irrevocable David Hayes Architectural Preservation Trust." He paused, letting the name of the trust sink in. My heart swelled with a fierce, protective pride. David's name, his legacy, was now a shield. "The purpose of said trust," he continued, his eyes briefly flicking toward the shocked faces of our relatives, "is to preserve the architectural integrity of the property for historical purposes, and to use its liquid assets to fund scholarships for underprivileged architecture students at the University of Washington." I saw Aunt Carol's hand fly to her mouth, her eyes wide with a surprise that seemed almost admiring. Mark looked as though he had been physically struck, a deep, shuddering breath escaping his lungs. Mr. Gable arrived at the final, devastating clause. "The Trust's board has conferred the title of Executive Director upon Mrs. Evelyn Hayes and has, as its first official act, granted her a lifetime lease agreement to reside in and manage the property, ensuring its preservation in accordance with the Trust's mission." He finished reading and neatly folded the paper. The pen Chloe had pushed in front of me with such condescending sympathy dropped from her numb fingers. It rolled across the polished mahogany table with a soft, rattling sound before coming to a stop. Uncle Robert just stared, his mouth agape, his coffee forgotten. But it was Mark's reaction that I will never forget. He didn't shout, he didn't argue, he simply deflated. It was not a gradual slump, but a sudden collapse, as if the bones had been summarily removed from his body. He sank back into his chair, utterly and completely broken, his eyes glassy as he stared at the ruin of a future he believed was his birthright. The truth had landed with the force of a physical blow. Mr. Gable placed the document gently on the table beside the untouched platter of quiche. "So you see," he concluded, his voice soft but carrying the finality of a closing tomb, "my client can't give you a house she no longer owns." He looked directly at Mark and Chloe, his gaze no longer that of a lawyer, but of an executioner of consequences. "Now, I believe you are in the process of pressuring the director of a charitable foundation. In fact, you are currently trespassing on its property. Shall we discuss your departure?" Humiliation is a surprisingly quiet affair. There was no screaming, no yelling, not at first, just the sound of Chloe's ragged, shallow breathing, a desperate, animalistic gasp for air in a room that suddenly had none. It was punctuated by the sharp, discordant scraping of chairs against the hardwood floor as our relatives scrambled to leave. The catastrophic revelation of the mansion's sale hung in the dining room, so thick and heavy it felt like a physical presence. The untouched brunch on the table, once a symbol of their false generosity, now looked like a funeral banquet for a family that had just died. Uncle Robert was the first to move, a man unaccustomed to being on the losing side of a power play. He fumbled with his napkin, dropping it on the floor, and cleared his throat with a loud, awkward sound that ripped through the stillness. He stood up, his movement stiff, carefully avoiding my gaze as if looking at me might turn him to stone. "Well, Carol," he said to his wife, his voice strained and unnaturally loud, we should be going. It's a long drive back." Aunt Carol, her face pale and her mouth a thin, bloodless line, just nodded numbly. She snatched her purse from the floor with the frantic haste of someone fleeing a burning building. As they hurried past the head of the table, their eyes flicked toward me for a fraction of a second, and I watched them go, remembering the condescending pity in their gazes when they had arrived just an hour ago. Now their glances were a complex, unsettling mixture of awe, fear, and a dawning, uncomfortable respect. They had come to witness the gentle decline of a confused old woman. They were leaving having seen the precise, calculated dismantling of her enemies. They didn't say goodbye. They fled as if the very air was toxic. Once they were gone, the four of us, me, Mark, Chloe, and the silent, watchful Mr. Gable, were left in the wreckage of their failed coup. Mark remained slumped in his chair, a hollowed-out version of the man he was, his eyes staring blankly at the swirling grain of the mahogany table. But the shock was beginning to wear off Chloe, replaced by a dark, venomous rage that brought a splotchy, unbecoming red to her cheeks. She slowly rose to her feet, her knuckles white where she gripped the back of her chair for support. She looked at me. Her eyes narrowed into slits of pure hatred. "You planned this," she whispered, the words a hiss of poison. "All of it. You played the victim. All those times you acted so helpless, so confused. You were laughing at us. You tricked us." I didn't take the bait. I didn't even look at her. Arguing with Chloe would be like wrestling with smoke. My business was not with her venom. It was with the son my husband and I had raised. I turned my calm, sad gaze to Mark. "Your father always believed in consequences, Mark," I said, my voice soft but carrying across the silent room. "He believed that a man is defined not by his ambitions, but by the lines he refuses to cross. It's time you learned what that means." That finally broke through his stupor. He looked up at me, his face collapsing, his eyes shimmering with tears. He could no longer hold back. The broken boy I had spent a lifetime protecting was finally visible beneath the shell of the weak man he had become. "Mom," he began, His voice choked, a single word filled with a universe of regret. I held up a hand, a simple, gentle gesture that stopped him cold. The time for apologies, for explanations was over. The word Mom no longer held the same meaning between us. It had been a key she had used to unlock my generosity, a title he had used to justify his neglect. No more. "I am the director of this foundation, Mark," I said, my voice clear and firm, establishing a new reality, a final boundary. "This is the foundation's property, and you are on its property without invitation. I need you to leave, both of you." Mr. Gable, who had remained a silent pillar of support by the sideboard, took a slight step forward, his presence reinforcing my authority, a silent confirmation that the rules had changed permanently. Mark just stared at me, the boy I had raised, now a stranger I was evicting. The tears spilled from his eyes, tracing paths through the ruin of his face. For the first time, in that terrible, quiet moment, he seemed to understand that some things, once broken, could never be put back together. 6 months later, the Seattle rain felt different. It wasn't the gloomy, oppressive drizzle that had mirrored my despair. It was a cleansing. It washed over the large windows of the mansion, making the lush green of the lawn and the deep gray of the lake seem brighter, more vibrant. The house itself had changed too. The silence was gone, replaced by the quiet, purposeful hum of activity. David's study was now my office, the headquarters of a life I had never expected, and the grand dining room, once the stage for my humiliation, was now a conference room where futures were built. I was finishing a board meeting with Mr. Gable and Susan, who had enthusiastically agreed to serve as a community liaison for the foundation. We were reviewing the final candidates for our first scholarship. My mail was on the desk, and a crisp, official letterhead from the University of Washington sat on top. I opened it, my heart swelling with a fierce, protective pride. "We've made our first award," I announced to the room, my voice thick with emotion. The letter detailed how the first grant from the David Hayes Architectural Preservation Trust had been awarded to a brilliant young woman from a low-income family in eastern Washington, a girl who dreamed of designing sustainable public housing. I thought of David's words in his letter, of the foresight he'd had, and a genuine warm smile touched my lips. His legacy was not just in the walls of this house, but in the futures it could now build. After the meeting, as I sat alone in the quiet of my office, my eyes fell upon another letter, a single plain envelope addressed to me in Mark's familiar, looping handwriting. For a moment, my heart clenched. I hadn't heard a word from him since that day. I hesitated, then slid my letter opener under the seal. The note inside was brief, stilted, and devoid of any real apology. "Mom," it read. "I'm writing to let you know that Chloe and I have separated. It turns out a one-bedroom apartment and 2 part-time jobs aren't the life she signed up for. The debts were too much. The shame. Well, I'm working at a lumber yard now. It's honest work. I hope you're doing well." That was it. No, I'm sorry. No, I was wrong. Just the flat, gray facts of his defeat. He had lost his wife, his career, his home, and his inheritance, all at the altar of his own greed and weakness. I folded the letter and felt not a shred of triumph, only a deep, profound sadness for the son who had to lose everything to learn anything at all. I did not feel compelled to rescue him. His journey, for the first time in his life, was his own. Later that evening, I took my cup of tea out onto the porch. The rain had stopped, and the setting sun was painting the clouds in shades of rose and gold. I watched the ferries glide across the sound in the distance, no longer feeling the crushing weight of loneliness, but a quiet contentment in my own company. My gaze drifted to the portrait of David that hung just inside the French doors, his eyes kind and smiling, as if he were watching over me. I walked over and gently traced the edge of the ornate gold frame. I thought of the terrified woman I had been, cornered and heartbroken, I thought of the strength I had found in his final gift, a strength I never knew I possessed. I protected it, David. I whispered to the portrait, my voice soft in the twilight. I protected our home, and I finally learned how to protect myself. A sense of profound peace washed over me, a feeling so deep and absolute it felt like coming home. The waiting was over. The fighting was done. My new life had just begun. Watching the sunrise from my porch this morning, I no longer thought about what I had lost, but about everything I had reclaimed, my freedom, my home, and my purpose. The hardest lesson I learned wasn't about money or betrayal, but about the nature of true strength. It isn't found in anger, but in quiet resolve and careful preparation. True justice, I discovered, isn't about revenge. It's about reclaiming the dignity you refuse to let anyone else take away. That new purpose has become my true legacy. Have you ever turned a painful experience into your greatest source of strength? I would be honored to hear your story in the comments below.